Obese girl sold like cattle. The words echoed through society's dark underbelly, where human dignity was nothing but a price tag. Mountain Man bought her and said, "Your body is so stunning," a statement that would change everything she believed about herself. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The church bell tolled mournfully above the town square, each clang like a death knell to Leilani Wheeler's dignity. Snowflakes drifted down from the slate-gray Colorado sky, melting on the wooden auction platform where she stood trembling. Her father, Jim Wheeler, gripped her arm with calloused fingers, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey as he shoved her forward. "Stand up straight, girl," he muttered, swaying slightly. "Harrison wants his money, and you're all I got left to trade." Leilani kept her head bowed, allowing her long, dark hair to cascade forward, creating a protective curtain between her burning face and the jeering crowd. Through the strands, she glimpsed familiar faces, men who'd tipped their hats to her at church, women who'd shared recipes, now transformed by cruel amusement as they assessed her worth with critical eyes. "Folks, we have here a healthy young woman," the auctioneer called out, his voice slicing through the bitter cold. "Might be carrying some extra weight, but that means she'll survive the winter better than most." Raucous laughter erupted from the crowd, and Leilani's shoulders hunched further, trying to make herself smaller despite knowing the impossibility of disappearing. "She can cook, clean, and sew," the auctioneer continued, circling her like a predator. "A fine addition to any household in need of domestic help. Shall we start the bidding at $50? The silence that followed was worse than the mockery. Not a single voice called out, not one hand raised. Leilani's chest tightened painfully as the auctioneer cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the lack of response. $40 then? He tried again, desperation creeping into his tone. Surely someone sees the value in a strong young woman. From the corner of her eye, Leilani spotted Mr. Harrison, the rancher to whom her father owed a substantial debt. The man's thin lips curled into a satisfied smirk as he watched her humiliation unfold. He had no intention of bidding. This spectacle was punishment enough for her father's failures. Jim Wheeler shifted his weight, mumbling curses under his breath. "Ungrateful town," he slurred, his fingers digging deeper into Leilani's arm. "After all I've done." Leilani bit her lip to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she forced back tears. The townspeople's whispers reached her ears. Cruel observations about her size, snide remarks about her prospects, wagers on whether anyone would bid at all. Each word cut deeper than the last, confirming what she'd always suspected. In their eyes, she was worthless. The auctioneer's voice grew increasingly desperate. $25, anyone. His gavel hovered uncertainly as the crowd's attention began to wander, some already turning away as if the spectacle had grown boring. In that moment, Leilani Wheeler had never felt more alone, more exposed, more like cattle being assessed and found lacking. The silence that followed the auctioneer's call for bids hung heavy in the cold mountain air. Leilani Wheeler kept her eyes fixed on the rough wooden planks beneath her feet, each second of quiet rejection cutting deeper than any spoken insult. The crowd's snickers had faded to an unbearable stillness that confirmed what she'd always been told. She was worthless. Then came the sound. Heavy, deliberate footsteps cutting through the crowd. The townsfolk's murmurs ceased abruptly, replaced by the shuffling of bodies as people scrambled to clear a path. Leilani dared to lift her gaze just enough to see the sea of onlookers parting like water before a ship's bow. Bennett Boone strode forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the auction platform. The mountain man they called Nay Tai, a name whispered with equal parts fear and respect throughout Colorado territory. His buckskin clothing bore the marks of wilderness living, and his beard, thick and untamed, framed a face weathered by years of mountain winters. Without a word, Bennett reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch. The soft thud it made when he dropped it onto the platform belied the weight of gold within. The auctioneer's eyes widened as several coins spilled out, glinting in the afternoon light. "I'll take her," Bennett announced, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "That should cover Wheeler's debts and then some." The crowd stood frozen, their mockery silenced by the mountain man's unexpected intervention. Jim Wheeler swayed drunkenly at the edge of the platform, seemingly unable to process what was happening. Bennett's eyes found Leilani's, and she was startled by the gentleness she found there, so at odds with his fearsome reputation. "Look at me, girl," he said, softer now, but still loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Your body is so stunning." Gasps rippled through the gathering. Leilani's head snapped up in disbelief, certain she had misheard. No one had ever spoken of her with anything but derision. "Strong," Bennett continued, his gaze unwavering, "built to survive these mountains, worth 10 of these town-soft fools." The whispers began immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Women clutched at their husbands' arms, men shifted uncomfortably, and children stared openly at the spectacle. The fearsome mountain man defending the size and strength of a woman they'd only ever mocked. It was unprecedented. Leilani felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. For the first time in her 20 years, someone had seen value in her, not despite her body, but because of it. "The sale is complete," Bennett declared, his tone brooking no argument. "She comes with me now." Bennett Boone's piercing gaze swept across the crowd, transforming their mocking laughter into uncomfortable silence. His massive frame seemed to grow even larger as he stood protectively beside Leilani Wheeler, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You all should be ashamed," he growled, his voice carrying across the town square. "A person's worth isn't measured by the size of their body, but by the strength of their spirit." The townsfolk shifted uneasily, some looking at their boots, others pretending sudden interest in the cloudy Colorado sky. Jim Wheeler swayed drunkenly at the edge of the platform, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as he reached for the leather pouch of gold. Bennett stepped forward, blocking his path with surprising speed for such a large man. "You've lost all rights to call yourself her father," the mountain man declared coldly. "When you put your own flesh and blood on this auction block, you severed that bond forever." His words hung in the air like frost, and even the auctioneer took a step back. Jim mumbled incoherently, his alcohol-soaked brain struggling to form a retort. Finally, he spat on the wooden planks and stumbled away toward the saloon, not once looking back at his daughter. Leilani stood frozen, her dark hair still partially hiding her face, unable to process the rapid change in her circumstances. Bennett turned to her, his expression softening as he shrugged off his buckskin jacket and draped it gently around her shoulders. "You won't be needing this anymore," he said quietly, taking the tattered shawl she'd been clutching and letting it fall to the platform. The jacket enveloped her like a protective embrace, still warm from his body and smelling of pine and wood smoke. With surprising gentleness, he guided her down the rickety steps of the auction platform. The crowd parted before them, no one daring to meet Bennett's eyes or utter the cruel jokes that had flowed so freely minutes before. Mr. Harrison, the ruthless rancher who had been pressing for payment, watched from the shadows of the general store, his face unreadable. They walked in silence through the muddy streets, his tall figure beside her a shield against the whispers that followed. Leilani clutched the edges of the buckskin jacket, feeling its weight and warmth like armor against the world that had been so cruel. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the squelch of their boots in the mud. Bennett nodded once, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "No need for thanks. No human deserves to be treated as less than human." As they reached the edge of town, the church bell tolled 4 times, marking not just the hour, but what felt to Leilani like the closing of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Behind them, the frontier town continued its business, but ahead lay a future neither of them could have anticipated when the sun rose that morning. As they reached the edge of town, Bennett Boone pulled his mule to a halt near a sturdy pine where his horse was tethered. The animal nickered softly at their approach, steam rising from its nostrils in the cold mountain air. Leilani Wheeler sat quietly behind him, her hands still trembling from the ordeal at the auction block. "I need you to understand something," Bennett said, his voice gentler than it had been in the town square. He helped her down from the mule with strong, careful hands. "I paid that gold to free you, not to own you." Leilani looked up at him, confusion written across her features. No man had ever spoken to her with such respect before. "You have a choice now," he continued, meeting her gaze directly. "You can come with me to my cabin in the mountains, or you can go wherever else you wish. I'll give you enough money to reach the next town if that's what you want. The mountain man shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking in the silence. But I won't force you. That's not why I stepped forward today. Leilani wrapped his buckskin jacket tighter around her shoulders. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dirt path, and in the distance she could hear the familiar sounds of the town, the place that had only ever shown her cruelty. She thought of her father, Jim Wheeler, who had sold her without a backward glance, stumbling off to the saloon with coins in his pocket. She remembered the years of sidelong glances, whispered comments about her size, and the laughter that followed her down every street. Then she looked at Bennett, this stranger who had defended her worth in front of everyone, who had silenced their mockery with nothing but his presence and conviction. "Why did you do it?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you pay so much for someone like me?" "Because no person should be treated as less than human," he answered simply. "And because I saw something in you that they were too blind to see." Leilani took a deep breath, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its first fragile seedling. "I'll go with you," she decided, straightening her shoulders slightly. "I have nothing to stay for here." Bennett nodded once, then helped her onto his horse before mounting the mule himself. As they rode away from the frontier town, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. Leilani didn't look back at the life she was leaving, a life of shame and ridicule. Instead, she faced forward, toward the wilderness and whatever new beginning awaited her there. Bennett Boone's calloused hand wrapped around Leilani Wheeler's with unexpected gentleness as he guided her down from the auction platform. Unlike the rough handling she'd endured from her father minutes earlier, the mountain man's touch conveyed care and respect, as if he were helping a lady from a carriage rather than a woman who had just been sold like livestock. "Mind your step," he murmured, his deep voice barely audible over the continued murmurs of the crowd. The woods slippery with frost. Leilani felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her back as they walked away from the platform. The townsfolk's reactions varied wildly, some still snickering behind their hands, others suddenly finding the muddy ground fascinating, shame coloring their features now that Bennett's fierce defense had forced them to confront their cruelty. A few women whispered behind gloved hands, no doubt speculating about what fate awaited her with the notorious mountain dweller. "Don't pay them any mind," Bennett said, his buckskin jacket still draped protectively around her shoulders. "Their opinions matter less than winter snow in July." Through her peripheral vision, Leilani spotted Jim Wheeler stumbling toward the saloon, the pouch of gold already clutched in his trembling hand. Her father didn't spare even a backward glance at the daughter he'd just sold to settle his debts. 23 years as his child, and he walked away without a word of farewell. At the edge of town, Bennett's mule waited patiently, secured to a hitching post. The animal's gentle eyes showed none of the judgment Leilani had faced from humans. "She's steady," the mountain man explained, patting the mule's neck. "Sure-footed than any horse in these mountains, her name's Patience." With surprising strength, he lifted Leilani onto the animal's back, then mounted behind her. The mule shifted slightly, adjusting to their combined weight without complaint. "Hold here," Bennett guided her hands to the saddle horn. "We've got a few hours' ride ahead of us." As they departed, Leilani heard the blacksmith call out to someone. "There goes Natai with his new wife. Wonder how long before she runs screaming back to civilization." Bennett ignored the comment, clicking his tongue to urge Patience forward. They left the frontier town behind, following a narrow trail that wound upward into the snow-dusted pines. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their path as they climbed higher into the Colorado wilderness. "They say you live alone up there," Leilani finally ventured, breaking the silence between them. "I did," was his simple reply. "Until today." The implications of those 3 words hung in the crisp mountain air as they continued their ascent, leaving behind the world of auctions and shame for the unknown wilderness ahead. As dusk settled over the Colorado wilderness, Bennett Boone guided his mule beneath a cluster of towering pines. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and Leilani Wheeler hugged herself against the mountain chill. She watched with quiet fascination as the mountain man dismounted with practiced ease, his movements efficient and purposeful. "We'll make camp here for the night," Bennett said, helping her down from the mule. His hands were strong but careful, as though handling something of value rather than the burden she'd been made to feel her entire life. Leilani stood awkwardly as he began unpacking their supplies. The events of the day, her public humiliation, her father's final betrayal, and this stranger's unexpected intervention swirled in her mind like snowflakes in a storm. "Can I help?" she asked, desperate to feel useful rather than helpless. Bennett nodded. "If you'd like to gather some kindling while I set up the shelter, that would be welcome." As he worked on creating a lean-to against a large pine, Leilani collected fallen branches, grateful for the simple task. When she returned, he had already cleared a small area for a fire pit, surrounding it with stones. "I could prepare something to eat," she offered hesitantly. I'm good at cooking." The mountain man looked up, his expression softening. "That would be much appreciated." From his saddlebags he produced a small pot, some dried meat, and a few root vegetables. Leilani set to work, finding comfort in the familiar task. Her father had rarely acknowledged her cooking skills, often too drunk to notice what he was eating. She worked methodically, using melted snow for broth and herbs Bennett provided. When the stew was ready, she filled 2 wooden bowls and handed one to him. The mountain man took a spoonful and closed his eyes. "This is excellent," he said after a moment. "Best trail meal I've had in years." Leilani felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you," she whispered, unused to praise. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and distant howl of wolves, the only sounds breaking the night's stillness. Bennett occasionally glanced at her, not with the mockery or pity she was accustomed to, but with something that looked remarkably like respect. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked finally. "My mother taught me before she passed," Leilani replied. "It was the one thing my father couldn't take away." Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "A valuable skill in these mountains, more valuable than most realize." As the fire burned low and stars appeared overhead, Leilani felt something unfamiliar settling between them. A fragile trust, delicate as frost, but just as real. For the first time in years, she wasn't being judged by her size or appearance. In the wilderness with this quiet, respectful man, she was being measured by her capabilities instead. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing into the night sky as Leilani Wheeler wrapped Bennett's buckskin jacket tighter around her shoulders. She stared into the flames, trying to make sense of the day's events that had turned her world upside down. Just hours ago, she had stood trembling on an auction block, her father's debts becoming the chains of her shame. Now she sat beneath a canopy of stars beside a mountain man whose reputation inspired fear throughout the Colorado Territory. "Is he my rescuer, or simply another captor?" she wondered, stealing a glance at Bennett's sleeping form. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, his face peaceful in slumber, so different from the fierce expression that had silenced a jeering crowd. The mountain man had defended her when no one else would, had spoken of her with dignity when others had only mockery to offer. Leilani poked at the embers with a stick, remembering how Bennett had praised her cooking earlier. "Best trail meal I've had in months," he'd said, his voice genuine. Such simple words, yet they had warmed her more deeply than the fire before her. No one had appreciated anything about her in so long. The night wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and wilderness. This strange new freedom felt terrifying, yet exhilarating. In town, she had known exactly what to expect: the sideways glances, the cruel laughter, the disappointment in her father's eyes when he looked at her. But here, with this man who called himself Ne Tai, everything was uncertain. Bennett shifted in his sleep, and Leilani noticed how he had positioned himself between her and the darkness beyond their camp, as if protecting her even in slumber. His rifle lay within easy reach, yet he had shown her nothing but gentleness. His hands, calloused from mountain living, had helped her from the mule with surprising care. Perhaps, she thought, watching the firelight play across his weathered features, there is something more to life than the shame I've carried. The idea felt fragile, like a newly hatched bird, vulnerable yet persistent. Leilani added another small log to the fire, her movements careful not to disturb her companion. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by mockery and rejection. She dared to believe that her worth might not be measured by the jeers of drunken townsfolk or the disappointment of a father who had sold her to settle his debts. As the embers glowed against the darkness, Leilani felt the first tentative stirrings of hope taking root in her heart. The first light of dawn painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of gold and pink as Leilani Wheeler and Bennett stirred from their makeshift camp. The mountain man had risen before her, already preparing a modest breakfast of dried meat and hard biscuits over a small fire. "Eat well," Bennett encouraged, passing her a tin cup of steaming coffee. "The journey ahead demands strength." Leilani accepted the cup gratefully, her fingers warming against the metal. The night had been cold despite the shelter he had constructed, and she wondered what life in these mountains would truly be like. As they ate in companionable silence, she stole glances at her unlikely protector, still unsure what to make of the man who had claimed her at auction. After breaking camp, Bennett helped her mount the gentle mule, his hands respectful yet firm as he guided her foot into the stirrup. "The trail narrows ahead," he explained, pointing toward a winding path that disappeared into a grove of towering pines. "Trust your mount. These animals know the mountain better than most men." The journey proved more demanding than Leilani had anticipated. Having rarely ventured beyond the town limits, the steep inclines and treacherous passages left her muscles aching and her breath short. When they paused at midday beside a frozen creek, she couldn't hide her exhaustion. "I fear I'm slowing you down," she admitted, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Bennett shook his head. "The mountain teaches patience to all who climb her," he replied simply. "You're doing well for someone unaccustomed to such travel." As they continued their ascent, Neitai pointed out landmarks and signs of wildlife, a hawk circling overhead, deer tracks crossing their path, the distant howl of wolves. He showed her how to read the terrain, where ice might hide beneath innocent-looking snow, and how to shield her face from the cutting wind. "The cabin lies just beyond that ridge," he said as afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley below. "We'll reach it before nightfall." Noticing her discomfort, Bennett slowed their pace. "In town, they value only certain kinds of strength," he observed. "But up here, different skills keep a person alive. Can you cook?" "Yes," Leilani answered, surprised by the question. "Sew? Tend fires?" She nodded to each. "Then you bring valuable gifts to the high country," he stated matter-of-factly. "More useful than many who boast of their prowess." His words settled over her like a warm blanket. For the first time in memory, someone had recognized her abilities rather than focusing on her size. As they crested the final ridge, Leilani straightened her back despite her fatigue. Perhaps here, in this wild place with this unusual man, she might find a worth that had always eluded her in town. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow as Bennett Boone's cabin finally came into view. Nestled against a towering granite cliff that protected it from the worst of the mountain winds, the structure stood as a testament to resilience in this harsh landscape. Leilani Wheeler felt a mixture of relief and trepidation as they approached. Her body ached from the long journey, unused to the hours spent on horseback. "Home," Bennett announced simply, his deep voice carrying a note of pride. As they drew closer, Leilani noticed the careful craftsmanship of the cabin. Sturdy logs fitted tightly together, a stone chimney with smoke curling upward, and windows that caught the fading light. 3 sled dogs bounded toward them, their excited barks echoing across the clearing. Bennett dismounted with practiced ease, greeting each animal by name before turning to help Leilani down. "They're friendly," he assured her as the dogs circled curiously, "just eager for company." Inside, the cabin was modest but surprisingly orderly. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the single room. Furs and hand-woven blankets adorned the wooden furniture. Tools hung in precise arrangements on the walls, and shelves held provisions organized with military precision. "It's not much," Bennett said, watching her face carefully. "But it keeps the cold out." Leilani nodded, taking it all in. After the humiliation of the auction block, the simple dignity of this space felt like a palace. "I should explain something," he continued, removing his hat and setting it on a peg by the door. "I didn't buy you to be a servant." Her eyes met his, questioning. Life up here requires partnership, the mountain man explained, gesturing to the surrounding wilderness visible through the window. No one survives alone. I need someone to share the work, the decisions, the life. He moved to stoke the fire, giving her space to absorb his words. You'll have an equal share in everything, Bennett continued. Equal voice, equal responsibility. I've watched how you carry yourself, even in shame. There's strength in you that those fools in town couldn't see. Leilani's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. No one had ever spoken of her with such respect. I don't know much about mountain living, she admitted softly. You know more than you think, he replied. And what you don't know, you'll learn. I've seen your resilience. That matters more than experience. The fire popped and hissed as silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with possibility. Outside, the dogs had quieted, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. For the first time since being dragged to the auction block, Leilani felt something unfamiliar stirring within her. Hope. Bennett led Leilani through the cabin, his movements deliberate as he showed her the carefully organized supplies. Wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with preserved meats, dried herbs, and sacks of flour and beans. Winter's long up here, he explained, running his hand over a row of jars. Organization means survival. Each item has its place, and we keep track of what we use. Leilani nodded, taking mental notes as the mountain man pointed out the root cellar trapdoor beneath the kitchen area. She appreciated his methodical approach, something her father had never bothered with, leaving their home in perpetual chaos. I understand, she said softly. My mother taught me to keep stores organized before she passed. As Bennett reached up to show her where he kept extra blankets, he winced, his hand instinctively moving to his shoulder. Leilani noticed the grimace that crossed his weathered face. You're hurt, she observed. Old war wound, he replied, rolling his shoulder. Axe up in the cold. Leilani hesitated only a moment before speaking. I could prepare a stew. Something hearty might help with the pain. Bennett looked at her, surprise flickering across his features before a small smile formed. I'd appreciate that. She set to work, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of cooking. The cabin filled with the aroma of simmering meat and vegetables as she worked, adding pinches of dried herbs from Bennett's stores. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, and for the first time since leaving town, she felt truly useful. They ate in comfortable silence, the crackling fire and occasional howl of wind the only sounds. Bennett ate heartily, nodding his approval between bites. You have skill, he said finally, setting down his empty bowl. Best meal I've had in months. His simple praise warmed her more than the fire. When the meal was finished, Bennett rose and cleared their dishes, refusing her offer to help. You cooked? I'll clean, he stated matter-of-factly. As night deepened, Bennett gestured toward the single bed in the corner. You'll take the bed. I've got a cot I use near the hearth. Leilani shook her head. I couldn't take your bed. It's yours now, he interrupted gently. I sleep better knowing the fire's tended anyway. She watched as he arranged his bedding on a narrow cot positioned to block the draft from the door. The gesture spoke volumes. Not only was he giving her comfort, but he had placed himself as a barrier between her and any potential danger. Thank you, Leilani whispered, the words encompassing more than just the sleeping arrangement. Bennett nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly, before he turned to bank the fire for the night. Rest well. Tomorrow we begin our routine. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains outside the cabin window as Leilani Wheeler lay awake on the bed that Bennett had insisted she take. The crackling fire cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn logs, but her mind was far away, trapped in the echo of jeers and cruel laughter from the auction block. She could still feel the burn of shame on her cheeks, the weight of 100 mocking eyes as she stood there, her worth reduced to dollars no one wanted to pay. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks. Across the room, Bennett's breathing came steady and deep from his makeshift cot. Leilani turned her head to watch the mountain man's chest rise and fall beneath his woolen blanket. His face in sleep lost some of its weathered hardness, the lines around his eyes softening in the firelight. Strange how his presence brought such comfort. This cabin, barely more than a day's ride from town, yet worlds away from its cruelty, had become a sanctuary. The sled dogs nestled by the door huffed softly in their sleep, adding to the sense of protection that enveloped the small space. "You're safe here," Bennett had told her before they had retired for the night. Not empty words of false comfort, but a promise backed by the strength in his hands and the resolve in his eyes. Morning came with brilliant light reflecting off the snow. Leilani woke to find Bennett already up, kneeling beside the freshly stoked fire. His lips moved in silent prayer, eyes closed, hands clasped before him. She watched, not wanting to intrude on this private moment, but feeling drawn to the peace that seemed to radiate from him. When he finished, he looked up and noticed her watching. "Good morning," he said simply. "Do you pray every morning?" Leilani asked, sitting up and wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. The frontiersman nodded. "Every day since I came to these mountains, asked for strength today, and respect, for both of us." Respect. The word felt foreign on her tongue after years of ridicule. "The good Lord sees worth where others don't," Bennett replied, rising to his feet. "Maybe that's why our paths crossed when they did?" Something stirred in Leilani's chest, not hope exactly, but its distant cousin. She slid from the bed and, after only a moment's hesitation, knelt beside the fire where Bennett had been. "I don't know the right words," she whispered. "No right words needed," he said, turning to give her privacy. "Just speak what's true." Closing her eyes, Leilani bowed her head. Perhaps her arrival here wasn't chance or misfortune, but an answer to a prayer she hadn't known to make. As the morning light streamed through the cabin windows, she found herself thanking whatever force had guided her to this quiet sanctuary in the wilderness. The days settled into a rhythm as steady as the snowfall outside Bennett Boone's cabin. Each morning they rose with the pale winter sun, and each day brought new lessons. Bennett proved to be a patient teacher, his calloused hands guiding Leilani Wheelers as she learned to set snare traps for rabbits. "Your fingers are nimble," he observed as she wove thin wire into the perfect loop. "That's a gift in these mountains." Leilani felt warmth spread through her chest at the simple praise. Such words had been rare in her life with Jim Wheeler, who had only ever noticed her failures. "The trick is to think like the creature you're hunting," the mountain man explained, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. "Animals follow patterns, just like people." She nodded, absorbing every word. When they checked the traps the next day and found 2 plump hares, Bennett insisted the success was hers alone. Inside the cabin, he taught her to mend harnesses for the sled dogs, showing her stitches that would hold against the strain of winter travel. The leather felt alive beneath her fingers, and she found satisfaction in creating something useful and strong. "My mother taught me this stitch," she confided one afternoon, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before she passed." Bennett nodded, understanding the weight of shared memories. "She'd be proud to see how you've kept her teaching alive." In the evenings, Leilani prepared hearty stews that simmered through the night, filling the cabin with savory aromas. She experimented with dried herbs hanging from the rafters, discovering combinations that made Bennett close his eyes in appreciation at first taste. "Never had food this good," he declared, reaching for a second helping. "You have a gift, Leilani." With each passing day, her movements grew more confident. She no longer flinched when reaching for tools or apologized for taking up space. The woman who had once kept her head bowed on the auction block now stood straight, her eyes meeting Bennett's when they spoke. One evening, as they sat before the fire, Bennett taught her to carve simple figures from pine. Her first attempt, a lopsided bear, made them both laugh. "Not bad for a beginner," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You learn faster than anyone I've known." The praise settled into her bones, replacing old shame with quiet pride. Here, in this cabin far from town, her size didn't matter. What mattered were her capable hands, her quick mind, her willingness to try. "I never thought I could do any of this," she admitted, turning the wooden bear in her hands. "That's because nobody ever gave you the chance," he replied simply. "But you've always had it in you." In those winter days, Leilani found herself emerging from a lifetime of shadows, discovering capabilities long buried beneath the weight of others' judgment. And in Bennett's steady presence, she began to feel something she'd nearly forgotten existed, a sense of belonging. The smell of burning bread filled the cabin, sending Leilani Wheeler into a panic. Her hands trembled as she pulled the blackened loaf from the cast-iron stove. Memories flooded back. Her father's drunken rage when she'd ruined dinner, the public mockery of her worth. She braced herself, waiting for Bennett's disappointment to manifest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, eyes downcast. "I was distracted and forgot to check it." Bennett Boone approached slowly, his weathered face showing no trace of anger. "Bread burns. Happens to everyone up here," he said, taking the loaf and examining it. "The middle looks fine. We'll just cut away the burnt parts." Leilani watched in disbelief as he calmly sliced away the charred crust, salvaging what he could. No harsh words, no punishment, just practical solutions. The mountain man placed the edible portions on their wooden plates and sat down as if nothing unusual had happened. "But I wasted good flour," she protested, still expecting rebuke. "You didn't waste anything," he replied, breaking off a piece. "We're still eating, aren't we? And tomorrow you'll make another loaf. That's mountain life. We adapt." Tears threatened to spill as she realized the depth of his acceptance. Her father would have thrown the entire loaf at the wall, followed by a torrent of insults about her uselessness. Yet here sat Natai, eating burnt bread without complaint, treating her mistake as inconsequential. That evening, as the fire crackled and snow fell gently outside, Bennett took down a small, worn hymnal from his shelf. "My mother taught me these," he explained, his voice softer than usual. "Singing helps the long nights pass." He began with "Amazing Grace," his deep voice rough but sincere. After a verse, he nodded encouragingly toward Leilani. Hesitantly, she joined in, her voice quavering at first, then growing stronger as they continued through several hymns. Their imperfect duet filled the cabin with unexpected warmth. Leilani found herself smiling as their voices blended, his bass and her alto creating something beautiful in its imperfection. For perhaps the first time, she felt truly comfortable in her own skin, not judged for what she lacked, but appreciated for what she offered. As the final notes of Rock of Ages faded into the crackling of the fire, Leilani realized something had shifted inside her. The hard shell of shame that had encased her heart for years was beginning to crack, allowing tendrils of acceptance to grow in its place. "Thank you," she said quietly, not specifying whether she meant for the singing or for his kindness about the bread. Perhaps she meant for everything. Bennett nodded, understanding in his eyes. "We all deserve grace, Leilani, even for burnt bread." The sharp knock on the cabin door cut through the peaceful evening like a knife. Leilani Wheeler's hands froze mid-stitch as Bennett Boone rose from his chair, his face instantly alert. The mountain man moved with surprising grace for his size, one hand instinctively checking the firearm at his hip before opening the door. Marshal Frank Dillard stood on the threshold, snow dusting his broad shoulders. His expression was grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Evening, Nitai, Miss Wheeler. Mind if I come in? Got news you both need to hear." Bennett stepped aside, and the lawman stomped his boots before entering. His eyes darted between them, lingering momentarily on the domestic scene. Leilani by the fire with her mending, Bennett's coffee still steaming on the table. "Thaddeus Crawford is contesting the auction," the marshal said without preamble. "Claims Jim Wheeler owed him money before the sale, making you," he nodded toward Leilani, "collateral for those debts." The room seemed to grow colder. Leilani's stomach twisted as the familiar shame threatened to return. Just when she'd begun to feel safe, to believe in her worth, the past reached out with cruel fingers to drag her back. "That auction was witnessed by half the town," Bennett's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I paid fair and square," Marshal Dillard sighed. "Crawford saying Jim had no right to sell what was already promised as payment. He's got papers, or claims to." "Forged, most likely," Bennett replied, his jaw tight. "Maybe so, but Crawford has influence with Judge Harmon." The marshal turned to Leilani, his expression softening. "I'm sorry, miss. Thought you should know what's coming." She found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "What does he want from me?" "Same as every rancher wants. Cheap labor. Crawford's lost 3 hands to the silver mines." The marshal adjusted his hat. "Be careful. Crawford doesn't take kindly to being denied." Bennett moved to stand beside Leilani, his presence solid and reassuring. Tell Crawford if he wants to talk about debts, he can come to me directly, but he'll find no welcome if he comes with threats. The marshal nodded. I figured you'd say that. Just watch yourselves. Crawford's been known to settle disputes his own way when the law doesn't suit him. After Dillard left, silence filled the cabin. Leilani stared into the flames, fear and doubt swirling inside her. Bennett knelt beside her chair, his weathered hand covering hers. No man will take you from this home unless you choose to go, he said, his voice gentle but firm. I'll fight for you through law or force if needed. Leilani met his gaze, drawing strength from his unwavering resolve. Whatever came next, she would no longer face it alone. After Marshal Dillard departed, Leilani Wheeler sat by the cabin window, watching snowflakes dance in the fading light. Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap as thoughts of Caleb Matthews's threats weighed heavily on her mind. Perhaps if she left, Bennett wouldn't have to face such danger on her behalf. I should go, she whispered, turning to face Bennett. This is my burden, not yours. Bennett looked up from cleaning his rifle, his weathered face softening in the firelight. Your worth isn't measured by debts or threats, Leilani. Not by your father's failures or Matthew's greed. He set the weapon aside and crossed the room to join her. But I've brought nothing but trouble, she protested. That's not what I see. The mountain man's voice was gentle, yet firm. I see a woman who's faced cruelty with dignity, who's learned to trap and cook and survive in these mountains faster than anyone I've known. He gestured around the cabin. You've earned your place here. This is your home now if you want it. Leilani blinked back tears, unaccustomed to such unwavering support. In just months, this rugged cabin had become more of a home than anywhere she'd lived with Jim Wheeler. We'll need to gather evidence in town, Bennett continued, practical as always. The preacher keeps records of transactions, and the blacksmith witnessed your father's debts. The town, Leilani's voice faltered, remembering the jeers and mockery. Bennett knelt before her, his eyes level with hers. We face it together. You're stronger than you know. That night, as they prepared for the journey ahead, Leilani packed provisions while Bennett studied, the mountain paths on his worn map. The comfortable silence between them spoke of trust, built through shared hardship and quiet moments. The South Trail will be treacherous with spring thaw, he noted, tracing the route with his finger. We could take the ridge path, Leilani suggested. It's longer but safer this time of year. Bennett looked up, surprise and approval warming his expression. You've been paying attention to my lessons. She nodded, a small smile forming. I learn quickly when my teacher isn't cruel. Dawn broke clear and cold as they saddled the mule and prepared to depart. Leilani stood straighter now, her movements confident as she secured their provisions. No longer the shamed woman on the auction block, she faced the mountain path with determination. Ready? Bennett asked, offering his hand. Leilani took it, feeling the strength in his grip. Ready. Together, they set out down the winding trail, the cabin growing smaller behind them. Whatever waited in town, judgment, threats, or allies, Leilani would face it with Bennett beside her, her heart fortified by belonging and her spirit unbroken. The journey back to town was like walking into the belly of a beast. Leilani Wheeler felt every eye upon her as she and Bennett rode down Main Street, the same path where she'd been dragged to auction just weeks before. Whispers followed them like shadows, townspeople stopping mid-conversation to stare at the mountain man and the woman they'd once mocked. Hold your head high, Bennett murmured, his voice steady as the mule beneath them. You've nothing to be ashamed of. They dismounted outside the general store, where a cluster of men fell silent. Bennett placed his hand protectively at the small of her back, a gesture not lost on the onlookers. Afternoon, gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying across the muddy street. My partner here makes the finest venison stew this side of the Rockies. Saved my life during that last blizzard with her cooking. Leilani felt her cheeks warm at the public praise, but she stood taller beside him. She'd never been someone's partner before. Their first stop was the church, where Preacher Thomas welcomed them with cautious warmth. When Bennett explained the situation with Thaddeus Crawford's threats, the older man nodded gravely. I witnessed that auction. It wasn't right, the preacher admitted, unable to meet Leilani's eyes. The Lord sees worth where men see only weakness. I'll stand as witness that the transaction was completed fairly." From there, they visited the blacksmith, whose massive hands paused over his anvil when they entered his shop. The heat from the forge couldn't match the burning in Leilani's chest as she recognized him, one of the loudest mockers at her auction. "Samuel," Bennett greeted him, "we need your word on what you saw that day." The blacksmith wiped his brow, leaving a smudge of soot. "I saw Wheeler sell his daughter fair and square," he finally said. "And I saw you treat her with more dignity than any of us did." He turned to Leilani. "I'm sorry for what I said that day, miss." By evening, they'd secured 4 testimonies. As they walked back to the preacher's home where they'd been offered lodging for the night, Leilani noticed something strange. People nodding to her, acknowledging her presence not with scorn, but with something approaching respect. In the preacher's spare room that night, Leilani sat by the window watching snow begin to fall. Bennett had taken the barn, insisting she have privacy. The feather mattress beneath her was softer than anything she'd slept on in years. "You're not alone anymore," she whispered to her reflection in the darkened glass. For the first time since childhood, Leilani felt peace wash over her, not because the battle was won, but because she no longer fought it by herself. The mountain air bit with renewed chill as Leilani, Wheeler, and Bennett made their way back to the cabin. Snow crunched beneath their boots, the familiar silhouette of their home appearing through the pines like a beacon. Bennett's steps had grown labored, his right leg dragging slightly as they approached. "Your leg's troubling you," Leilani observed, noticing how he winced with each step. Bennett nodded, his weathered face tightening against the pain. "Old war wound. Acts up something fierce when the cold sets in deep." Inside the cabin, Leilani stoked the fire while Bennett eased himself onto a chair, massaging his thigh. Without being asked, she prepared a hot compress and brought it to him. "You rest," she said firmly. "I'll see to the woodpile." Bennett looked up, concern crossing his features. "That's heavy work." "I'm stronger than I look," she replied with a small smile, already reaching for his axe. Outside, Leilani positioned the first log and swung the axe with practiced precision. Her father had never bothered teaching her such skills, deeming them men's work, but she had watched and learned anyway. Each swing felt like freedom, each split log a testament to her capability. When Bennett hobbled to the doorway to check on her, he stood transfixed. Leilani's powerful arms brought the axe down again and again, her movements efficient and strong. Sweat glistened on her brow despite the cold, and her face showed determination rather than strain. "You're a marvel," he called out, genuine admiration in his voice. She paused, axe resting on her shoulder. "My father always said I was too big, too much. But here, being strong is useful." "Jim Wheeler was a fool who couldn't see treasure when it was right before him," Bennett replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Your strength is beautiful." By evening, a storm had descended upon the mountains. Wind howled around the cabin corners while Leilani and Bennett sat before the crackling fire, sharing a meal of rabbit stew. The mountain man's stories of wilderness adventures brought laughter to her lips, a sound that had grown more frequent in recent weeks. As night deepened, they sang hymns together, their voices blending in the fire-lit cabin. Bennett's deep baritone complemented Leilani's clear, sweet tones. The songs spoke of redemption and grace, themes that resonated in the quiet spaces between them. "I never thought I'd find this," Leilani confessed during a lull in their singing. "Find what?" Bennett asked. "Home," she answered simply. "Not just a place, but this feeling, like I belong exactly as I am." Bennett's eyes softened in the firelight. "That's what home should be." Outside, the storm raged on, but within those sturdy walls, shame had given way to joy, and 2 souls found healing in the simple gift of acceptance. Spring arrived in the mountains with a rush of melting snow and new greenery. Leilani Wheeler stood at the cabin door, breathing in the fresh scent of pine and earth. The winter had transformed her in ways she never imagined possible, her strength now matching the majesty of the landscape around her. "We should sort through your belongings properly," Bennett suggested one morning, eyeing the small bundle she'd brought from town. "Spring cleaning," he added with a gentle smile. Leilani nodded, pulling out the worn satchel her father had hastily packed for her before the auction. As she emptied its meager contents, her fingers brushed against a hidden pocket in the lining. Curious, she worked it open and extracted several yellowed papers. "Bennett," she called, her voice uncertain, "what are these?" Natai crossed the cabin in 3 long strides, taking the documents with careful hands. His eyes widened as he scanned the faded ink. "These are water rights deeds," he said, voice dropping to a whisper. "For Mountain Spring." "Mountain Spring?" Leilani asked, moving closer to examine the papers. "The main water source for this entire region," Bennett explained, spreading the documents on the table. "Your father must have been holding on to these all this time." His finger traced the signature at the bottom. "These are in your grandfather's name, which means they now legally belong to you." The realization dawned slowly. "Is this valuable?" Bennett's laugh was short and sharp. "Valuable doesn't begin to describe it. Thaddeus Crawford has been trying to claim those rights for years. That's why he's been threatening us. He must have suspected your father had these papers." Leilani sat heavily on a nearby chair, the weight of this discovery settling on her shoulders. "So I own the water rights that Crawford wants?" "You do," Bennett confirmed, his eyes shining with something like pride. "This changes everything." For a moment, Leilani felt a flicker of fear. Then it vanished, replaced by resolve. The woman who had been dragged to an auction block months ago would have cowered at such responsibility. But that woman was gone. "I could help people with this," she said slowly. "Not just ourselves, but others who need fair access to water." Bennett knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You could, and you would do it with wisdom and compassion." Looking into his eyes, Leilani saw not just belief, but certainty. The mountain man who had once seemed so fearsome now looked at her with unwavering trust in her judgment. "Then that's what we'll do," she decided, squeezing his rough hands. "We'll use these rights for good." Outside, the spring breeze carried the promise of new beginnings. Inside, Leilani felt the last vestiges of her old life fall away, replaced by purpose and power she never knew she possessed. News of Leilani Wheeler's legitimate claim to the Mountain Spring water rights spread through the frontier town like wildfire. Thaddeus Crawford's face twisted with rage when Marshal Frank Dillard delivered the confirmation that the deeds were indeed valid. "Those papers belong to me." Crawford slammed his fist on the table, sending whiskey splashing across the wooden surface. "That mountain man and his fat girl won't take what's rightfully mine." The rancher gathered his men, 6 hardened cowboys who'd done his dirty work before. They mounted their horses and rode toward Bennett's cabin as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountain path. Marshal Dillard arrived at the cabin first, his horse lathered from the hard ride. "Crawford's coming with his men," he warned, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "The deeds are legal, but that won't stop him. He controls half the county." Bennett nodded grimly, checking his rifle. "We knew this day might come." He turned to Leilani, his eyes softening. "You should hide in the root cellar." "I'm staying right here," she replied, loading the second firearm with steady hands. "This is my home, too." They didn't wait long. Hoofbeats thundered across the clearing as Crawford and his men surrounded the cabin. "Come out, Boone!" Crawford shouted. "Bring those papers and the girl." Bennett stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "The deeds belong to Leilani. The law's already decided." The first shot cracked through the air without warning. Bennett staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Leilani pulled him inside as bullets splintered the doorframe. "I'll be fine," he gasped, pressing a cloth to the wound. "But they'll burn us out if they can't shoot us out." Leilani's mind raced. The original deeds were hidden at Crawford's ranch, papers her father had stolen years ago. Without those originals, their copies might not stand in court against Crawford's influence. "I need to get to Crawford's ranch," she whispered. "Too dangerous," Bennett protested, but his face had gone pale from blood loss. While the men focused their fire on the front of the cabin, Leilani slipped out the back window. Her size, which had once brought her shame, now gave her strength as she moved through the forest with surprising stealth. She reached Crawford's empty ranch house as dusk fell. Inside, she found the safe behind a painting, just where the blacksmith had once mentioned seeing important papers. Using a metal rod from the fireplace, Leilani leveraged her weight and broke it open. There, yellowed with age but unmistakable, lay the original Mountain Spring deeds, her birthright and their future. With the papers secured inside her dress, she mounted one of Crawford's own horses and rode back toward the cabin, determination burning brighter than fear. Behind her, she could hear shouting. Crawford's foreman had discovered the break-in, but Leilani pressed forward, the mountain wind in her hair and courage in her heart, riding to save the man who had seen her true worth when no one else would. Leilani burst through the tree line, clutching the water rights deeds against her chest. Her heart pounded as she surveyed the scene below. Crawford's men had Bennett cornered on the porch, blood seeping through his shirt where a bullet had grazed his shoulder. She would not lose him now, not after everything they'd built together. "Stop!" she called out, her voice carrying across the clearing with unexpected authority. "I have the deeds right here." As if summoned by her courage, Marshal Dillard appeared with several townsfolk behind him, rifles raised. The blacksmith and preacher were among them, standing tall beside the lawman. "That's enough, Crawford," Dillard commanded, training his weapon on the rancher. "Those papers are legitimate. I've seen the county records myself." Crawford's face contorted with rage. "This mountain trash and his fat—" "Choose your next words carefully," Bennett interrupted, his voice low but carrying the weight of thunder despite his injury. The marshal stepped forward, handcuffs glinting in the sunlight. "Thaddeus Crawford, you're under arrest for attempted murder, trespassing, and theft of legal property." As Crawford was led away, Leilani rushed to Bennett's side, gently examining his wound. The townsfolk watched with newfound respect in their eyes, no longer seeing her size but witnessing her strength. "You came back for me," Bennett whispered, wincing as she pressed a cloth to his shoulder. "Of course I did," she replied. "This is my home now. You are my home." Later, as spring flowers dotted the mountain slopes and Bennett's wound healed, they sat together on the cabin porch. The water rights had brought unexpected prosperity, allowing them to help struggling families access the precious resource that Crawford had tried to monopolize. "You know," Bennett said, taking her hand in his calloused palm, "when I said your body was stunning that day at the auction, I meant it, but not how they all thought." Leilani looked up, meeting his clear gaze. "Your body carried you through years of cruelty without breaking. It's strong enough to split wood when my old wounds act up. It's gentle enough to tend seedlings and brave enough to face down armed men." He touched her cheek softly. "Your body is stunning because it harbors the bravest heart I've ever known." Tears welled in her eyes as she leaned against his shoulder. Together, they had transformed shame into dignity, cruelty into kindness, and two lonely souls into a family bound by respect and love. The mountain winds carried their laughter down to the town below, a testament to the truth Bennett had known all along, that true worth is measured not by appearance, but by the courage to claim one's place in the world.